The 8th of November, 1942, 7:17 hours. The Solomon Sea. The sun had not yet burned the mist from the water. It hung like a shroud over the U.S. Navy's last line of defense, a task force built around the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, already scarred and smoking from a hit taken 3 days prior. She was a wounded animal limping south, and the hunters knew it. Inside the ship's Combat Information Center, the air was thick with stale coffee and static. A young radar operator froze, his hand hovering over the glowing green scope. The blips were not ships. They were a swarm materializing from the northwest, from the direction of the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. He counted. Then he counted again, his blood turning cold. The plot told a story of annihilation. The report delivered to him was not a strategic assessment. It was a death sentence. 2 pilots, against 60, by every known rule of naval aviation, by every tactical doctrine written in blood since the war began. This was not a battle. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was a ritual sacrifice. The Enterprise, the irreplaceable Big E, and every man aboard her had minutes to live. The Japanese formation was not probing. It was not scattered. It was a concentrated spear aimed directly at the carrier's heart, and there was nothing left to throw in its path but 2 men. Thox looked at the other pilot slated to fly. His wingman, the man's face was pale. The odds were not daunting. They were obscene. To scramble was to commit to a form of suicide, so statistically absolute, it felt foolish. To stay aboard was to die with the ship. Thox made his decision not with a hero's fervor, but with the grim calculus of a man who has run out of choices. He sprinted for the deck. The morning air, thick and humid, filled with the frantic shouts of deck crews. As Thox climbed into his Wildcat, he saw the vast, empty sky to the northwest. Soon it would be etched with contrails and cannon fire. His plane captain strapped him in, hands moving with hurried, brutal efficiency. There was no time for the pre-flight ritual, no time to check anything but the essentials. The twin, Roe Pratt Whitney engine coughed, then roared to life. 2,000 feet away, his wingman's engine did the same, a synchronized tremor of defiance. 2 engines, against 60. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. History insists this should have ended here, on the stained wooden planks of the Enterprise with the first bomb hit. No rational commander would send 2 pilots into that, but history, in this moment, was wrong. The die was cast, the clock, irrevocably, started its final count. Fei hours. Flight deck USS Enterprise. The catapult officer was screaming, his voice shredded by prop wash and panic. Thox gave a sharp nod, his world narrowing to the instrument panel and the violent horizon ahead. The holdback block snapped. The catapult fired, a piston-driven hammer blow that slammed him back into his seat. His Wildcat, laden with ammunition and a full fuel load, was hurled into the void airborne. The sickening drop, then the grab of lift under the wings. He banked sharply, scanning the empty blue for his wingman. A second later, the other Wildcat clawed its way up to his starboard side. No words were exchanged over the radio. None were needed. They were a fragment of a shield, a single, fragile thread of defense stretched across a female front. Thox keyed his mic, his voice unnervingly calm to the controllers far below on the ship vector. "Give me a vector." The voice from the CIC was tight, strained. "Bogey swarm, bearing 320, Angels 15, range 40 miles, and closing fast. Estimate 60 bandits, repeat 60. The confirmation was a physical weight, 60. The number hung between the 2 pilots like a third, invisible aircraft. Thox looked at his fuel gauge. He had less than 90 minutes of flight time if he pushed the engine hard. This fight would be measured in seconds, not minutes. He thought of his men back on the Enterprise, at the machinists, the cooks, the boys manning the anti-aircraft guns who were now sealing themselves into their steel tubs. They were all betting their lives on a mathematical impossibility. He switched to his gun sight, the electric reticle glowing a faint amber 6.5 caliber machine guns, 2,400 rounds of ammunition. In theory, enough to kill 20 aircraft if every round was a perfect hit. In reality, in the screaming chaos of a dogfight, it was enough for maybe 3 or 4 kills before the guns ran dry. He would have to make every single bullet count. He would have to become a surgeon of violence. Climbing to 18,000 feet, the world below became a patchwork of deep blue sea and the faint, smoky smear of the task force. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. And then he saw them, to the northwest. The horizon was no longer clear. It was a dark, vibrating stain. It shimmered and pulsed, resolving slowly into distinct shapes, the sleek, deadly lines of Zero fighters stacked in layered escorts. And below them, the heavier, purposeful silhouettes of the torpedo bombers. They were not in a loose formation. They were in a disciplined, integrated box, a flying fortress. The bombers were nestled inside a moving cage of fighter escorts. The Japanese commander was not taking chances. He was delivering a killing blow with overwhelming contemptuous force. Thak's mouth went dry. Standard interception doctrine called for an altitude advantage, for diving out of the sun with a squadron at your back. He had no altitude advantage. He had no squadron. He had one other plane, the rational part of his mind, the part trained at Annapolis and honed in 100 briefings, shut down. It was replaced by something colder, more primal. There was no plan that could work. Therefore, the only plan was to attack, to hit the swarm at its head, to cause chaos, to make the first 30 seconds so violently disorienting that the formation might falter for a crucial moment. He keyed the radio, a single flat sentence to his wingman: "We take the leaders. Stay on me." He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Wildcat's engine howled in protest. Then ascent. The two American fighters, alone against the sky, turned not away, but directly into the heart of the swarm. They were not defending. They were initiating an ambush for an army. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 10 miles, 5, individual aircraft became clear. He could see the red Hinomaru on the wings. He picked his target, not a fighter, but one of the lead bombers in the first wave. Kill the brain, and the body might stumble. In 30 seconds, they would be in range. In 30 seconds, the first Zeros would peel off to engage. He took a deep breath, the oxygen from his mask tasting of rubber and metal. The first rule of the Thak-weave was mutual sacrificial support. But against 60 enemy aircraft, the weave was a death spiral. They would have to invent a new kind of combat in the next 60 seconds, or they would simply die 7:31 hours. Interception point: the first rule of engagement was obliterated before a shot was fired. The first rule of engagement was obliterated before a shot was fired. The Japanese formation did not react as expected. They did not scatter or divert fighters aggressively. The escorting Zeros held their tight, disciplined positions around the bombers. This was not a hunting pack. It was a phalanx. The enemy commander had one objective: deliver the bombers to the Enterprise. He would not be baited. He would not play the fighter pilot's game. The two Wildcats were insects to be ignored or swatted aside if they came too close. This calculated indifference was more terrifying than a headlong charge. It meant the enemy held all the cards and knew it. Thash understood instantly. A direct slashing attack on the bomber formation would see his and his wingman's planes shredded by concentrated fire from 24 Zeros before they could even fire a burst. They had to break the symmetry. Forget the bombers. Thash barked over the radio, his voice cutting through the static. We go for the high cover, make them look at us. It was a desperate, almost nonsensical gambit. The high-flying Zero escorts were the least immediate threat. They were there to counter a proper, large-scale American fighter response that did not exist. Attacking them was a distraction, a magician's trick. But it was the only move left on the board. The two Wildcats nosed up, engines screaming at maximum war emergency power, clawing for every foot of altitude toward a tier of 6 Zeros flying a lazy, watchful pattern 1,000 feet above the main formation. The Wildcat was not a climber. It was a blunt instrument. The Zero was a rapier, lighter, more agile. Climbing to meet it was tactical suicide, which is why the Japanese pilots did not believe what they were seeing. The two American fighters were not diving to escape or making a pass. They were coming up into their domain. It was an insult. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. A breach of the unspoken rules, the lead Zero wing, confident, detached two of their number to deal with the nuisance. The two Zeros rolled over and dove, turning the Americans' climb against them, converting altitude into murderous speed. This was the moment Thak had gambled on. The enemy had taken the bait. They had broken formation, now break left on my mark, Thak called. His eyes glued to his mirror as the first Zero filled it, its wings sparkling with the premature muzzle flashes of its 20mm cannons. Orange golf balls of tracer fire lanced past his canopy mark. He stood the Wildcat on its left wing, pulling back on the stick with all his strength. The G-forces slammed down on him, a heavy weight sitting on his chest, pressing the blood from his head. His vision tunneled, grayed at the edges. Behind him, his wingman mirrored the maneuver, the two divings overshot, their speed now a liability. For 3 seconds, the Americans were vulnerable, hanging in their stalls. But those 3 seconds of mutual, planned vulnerability were the core of the THAC weave. As the first Zero pilot pulled out of his dive and began a climbing turn to re-engage THAC, he found not a solitary target, but the converging guns of THAC's wingman, who had now cut across the circle. A short, brutal burst of .50 caliber fire sawed through the Zero's light alloy tail. The aircraft did not explode. It simply came apart, spinning into the sea in a cloud of fragments. 1 down, 59 to go. But the arithmetic of annihilation had shifted. The first kill had taken 45 seconds of concentrated, coordinated maneuvering. At this rate, they would run out of fuel and ammunition, having accounted for only a handful of attackers, and below them, untouched, the bomber formation droned inexorably toward the Enterprise, now visible as a tiny gray smudge on the ocean. The distant, hollow thump of anti-aircraft fire reached them. The ship's guns were opening up a last futile prayer in steel. The battle had been lost in the opening move. THAC had traded a Zero for the one commodity they could not afford. Time was up. The lead elements of the Japanese torpedo bombers were now beginning their descent, angling for their attack runs. The Enterprise began a hard turn, throwing up a white wake of desperation. THAC, looking down from his embattled position, knew with a cold, sick certainty that he had failed. The math had been correct all along. Then, from the south, a new sound cut through the radio chaos and the roar of his own engine. A thin, distant drone, multiplying not 1 or 2 engines. Dozens, hours. The southern approach, the drone became a thunder. THAC, wrestling his Wildcat into a defensive corkscrew against a fresh Zero, chanced to glance south. What he saw defied comprehension. A ragged, glorious line of aircraft was storming over the horizon, flying just above the wavetops. Not the sleek Hellcats that would dominate the later war, but a mix of Wildcats and the older, slower F6F Buffaloes from the small escort carrier USS Copahi. They were not in a tidy formation. They were a mob, a winged brawl coming to the fight, and at their head was a man flying. Like the air itself was on fire, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butches O'Hare, the U.S. Navy's first fighter ace, a man who had single-handedly taken on a formation of Bettys over the open ocean to save the Lexington. O'Hara's group was not part of the Enterprise's task force. They had been en route as a reinforcement, a handful of replacement pilots and planes being ferried to the front. Intercepting the desperate distress calls from the Enterprise, they had turned toward the sound of the guns, not with a plan, but with a purpose. They were 12 aircraft. 12. Combined with THAC's 2, it raised the American total to 14. The odds shifted from 60 to 60 to 14. Still impossible. Still a death sentence by any tactical manual. But it was no longer a solitary execution, it was a brawl. O'Hare didn't bother with radio formalities. His voice, sharp and clear, cut across the frequency. THAC, you're pretty. Well, take the low road. It was a division of hell. THAC and his wingman, already engaged with the high cover, would continue their desperate weaving fight, keeping the top layer of Zeros occupied. O'Hara's 12, with the acute, terrifying advantage of surprise and low altitude, would do the unthinkable. They would attack the torpedo bomber's head, on from below and ahead, into the teeth of their defensive fire. The Japanese bomber pilots never saw it coming. Their focus was downward, on the maneuvering carrier, on the flak bursts, beginning to speckle the sky. Their fighter escorts were looking upward. At THAC, the southern approach was a blind spot, and O'Hare filled it with tracers. The first element of Wildcats and Buffaloes hit the lead Kate torpedo bombers like a scythe. The American fighters did not try for elegant deflection shots. They used the Wildcats' one overwhelming advantage, structural strength and firepower. They flew straight at the bombers, holding their triggers down, pouring .50 caliber rounds into cockpit glass, into engines, into full torpedo bays. It was a butcher's trade, conducted at closing speeds of over 500 knots. A Kate, its long aerial torpedo still slung beneath its belly, disintegrated in a flash of fuel and metal. Another, wing sheared off, cartwheeled into the sea. The disciplined box formation ruptured, bombers scattered, jettisoning their heavy payloads haphazardly to evade. The careful, orchestrated kill strike was suddenly a chaotic melee. But the cost was immediate and brutal. The slower buffaloes, obsolescent death traps in this war, were easy prey for the swift Zero escorts that now peeled down to protect their charges. Thok watched, helpless, as a buffalo to his left was caught by crossing cannon fire. It simply came apart, vanishing in a brief, ugly puff of smoke and debris. No parachute. The radio erupted in a frantic, overlapping cacophony. Break right? Break right? Zero on your tail, Jim? Im hit. Im going in. The sea, so vast and empty minutes before, was now a diorama of violence. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Smoking trails etched the sky, flaming aircraft spiraled downward. The neat, mathematical problem of interception had dissolved into a savage, close-quarter knife, fight spanning 20 miles of ocean and 10,000 feet of vertical space. Thok, his guns now half empty, his fuel gauge dipping toward the red, found himself locked in a turning duel with a Zero pilot of frightening skill. They were a binary star system of destruction, circling each other, each seeking the fatal angle. Thok knew he was losing. The Zero could turn inside him forever. He had one chance. He had to make the pilot blink. He shoved the stick forward, abandoning the turn, and dove straight for the deck. As if fleeing, the Zero, predictably, victoriously, followed. Thok counted the seconds in his head, the water rushing up to meet him. He waited for the moment the Zero pilot committed to a shooting solution. Then, with the sea so close he could see the whitecaps, he hauled back on the stick with every ounce of strength. His Wildcat groaning in protest, its wings threatening to fold. The Zero, lighter and more fragile, could not follow the pullout. It overshot, a blur of green and red. For one perfect, crystalline second, it filled Thak's windscreen. He fired. His remaining ammunition tore the aircraft in half. He was now out of ideas and nearly out of bullets. He looked for his wingman, he was gone. He looked for O'Harry's group. They were scattered, embroiled in a dozen individual fights. And through the chaos, he saw a determined wedge of perhaps 15 surviving Japanese bombers, having regrouped, now entering their final attack run on the Enterprise. The anti-aircraft fire from the fleet was a solid wall of black puffs and fiery tracers. But the wall had holes. The battle had reached its crescendo. The desperate counter-strike had bled the enemy, but it had not stopped them. The Enterprise began heeling into a violent evasive turn. Thak, alone, low on fuel and ammo, could only watch. The final act was about to begin, and he was a spectator. Fei hours, the final run. From Thok's position, low and off to the east, the scene unfolded with a horrific, silent, movie clarity. The Enterprise, a city of steel and men, was a study in frantic motion. Her wake was a tortured, twisting scribble on the ocean's surface. Every 5-inch and fade-M gun aboard her was firing, the concussions creating a continuous rolling thunder that reached him even through his canopy. The sky around the carrier was a hellish tapestry of black flak bursts and the slower red arcs of tracer fire. The surviving Japanese bomber skates and Vals did not flinch. They pressed into the storm. These were not the green pilots of Fei. These were veterans from Rabaul, the last of Japan's pre-war naval aviation elite. They knew their odds of survival were low. Their mission was not to return, it was to hit the carrier. Thak's hand hovered over his throttle. He had perhaps 300 rounds left across all 6 guns. Enough for 1, maybe 2, good bursts, to charge into that maelstrom, into the converging fire of both the Japanese bombers and the terrified American gunners on the ships below, who would see any aircraft as a target was to choose a specific, almost artistic form of death. He was a tactician, his mind calculated the angles, the probabilities, they all pointed to 0. But then he saw the pattern. The American anti-aircraft fire, for all its volume, was mis-aimed. It was leading the bombers, but it was patterned, predictable. The gunners were firing at formations, not individuals, and the Japanese pilots, in their final dedication, were holding their courses steady, aiming points fixed. A wild, reckless idea, born of absolute desperation, took shape. It violated every principle of air combat. It was not in any manual. He keyed his radio, hoping against hope that anyone from O'Hara's scattered group was listening on the same frequency. Any U.S. fighter, this is Thak. Do not attack the bombers. I say again, do not engage the bombers. Get above them. Get in the flak pattern, spook them, herd them, make them jink. It was insanity. He was asking his outnumbered, exhausted pilots to fly not into combat, but into their own ship's anti-aircraft fire, to use the deadly spray of American steel as a tool. To become sheepdogs, not wolves. For a long, static, filled moment, there was no reply. Then a single, strained voice. "Roger, moving." It was O'Hare. Thatch watched as first one, then two, then three Wildcats, their markings indistinct at this distance, pulled away from their dogfights and climbed. They did not dive on the bombers. Instead, they positioned themselves above and behind the attacking formations, well outside the effective range of the bombers' rear gunners. Then, they began a series of shallow, threatening dives and breaks, not firing, but mimicking the opening moves of an attack run. The effect on the bomber pilots was psychological warfare. A pilot beginning his death-defying final sprint is prepared for guns blazing from ahead. From the ships, his focus is there, to have fighters looming behind, in his mirror. In the space that should be secure, triggers a primal instinct to evade. It forces a choice: hold the steady course required for an accurate torpedo or bomb drop, or survive the next 10 seconds. The first Val dive, bomber to waver, was the tipping point. Its pilot, seeing a Wildcat's nose drop toward him in his peripheral vision, instinctively jerked his stick to the left. He broke formation. His beautiful, lethal dive was ruined. The bomb he released fell harmlessly into the Enterprise's boiling wake. Then another bomber jinked, then another. The rigid attack geometry, the product of years of Imperial Japanese Navy drill, dissolved into a series of individual, panicked evasions. The anti-aircraft gunners below, seeing the formations break, shifted from pattern fire to targeting the now isolated aircraft. The success rate of their fire multiplied. A Kate, its torpedo finally released on a wild off-angle trajectory, was caught by 3 simultaneous bursts of 40mm fire. It vanished in a sheet of flame. A Val, pulling out of its ruined dive, flew directly into the path of another's falling bomb. Chaos, the great leveler, had been weaponized. Thack, his fuel warning light now a persistent glowing red eye on his panel, knew his role was over. He had thrown the last stone. He turned his battered Wildcat toward the approximate location of the task force. A navigational guess more than a course. His engine, stressed beyond endurance for over 40 minutes, began to run rough. A misfire. Then another. The oil pressure gauge began to flutter. He was not going to be shot down. He was going to suffer the slower, more ignominious death of a mechanical failure, of drowning alone in the vast, indifferent sea after having done the impossible. The irony was bitter. He had helped turn the tide of an unwinnable battle, only to be claimed by a failed spark plug or a seized bearing. The sounds of the battle behind him, the crump of explosions, the staccato of guns began to fade, replaced by the labored, coughing rhythm of his own dying engine. The sea below, once a battlefield, was now just water, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The Enterprise was a smudge of smoke again, now receding. He switched his radio to the guard channel. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Wildcat 7, engine failure going down." Estimate position. He never finished the transmission. The engine coughed a final, shuddering breath of smoke and oil and died. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than any cannon fire. The only sound was the rush of wind over his canopy. He was a glider now, descending irrevocably toward the water. He had no time to think of victory or survival. He had only the practiced, mundane procedures of a pilot about to crash. Jettison the canopy, tighten the harness. Brace. The blue water, so calm from a distance, rushed up to meet him with shocking speed. 7:59 hours impact. The world dissolved into a violent, all-consuming roar of white. The Pacific Ocean was not soft. It was a concrete wall at 80 knots. Thack's Wildcat struck with a tremendous wrenching crash that slammed his head against the armored glass of the windscreen. Stars exploding behind his eyes. The aircraft did not skip or glide. It plowed in nose. First, the engine tearing loose from its mounts, the fuselage buckling around him like a crushed soda can. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Cold, shocking black water erupted through the shattered canopy, flooding the cockpit in an instant. The force of the deceleration had jammed the harness release. He was strapped into a sinking metal coffin. Panic, pure and electric, shot through his veins. He fumbled, his fingers thick and clumsy, clawing at the buckle as the greenish light from the surface faded above him. The pressure built in his ears. The cockpit was filling. The water rising to his chest, then his neck. With a final, desperate wrench, the latch gave. He kicked free of the sinking wreck, pushing himself upward through the swirling cloud of bubbles and leaking aviation fuel. He broke the surface, gasping, sucking in great lungfuls of salt air and acrid fumes. Around him, debris beat a piece of wing, a cushion, an oil slick spreading like a rainbow. He was alive, but he was alone in the middle of the Solomon Sea. The sounds of battle were distant thumps on the horizon. The Enterprise and her screen were miles away, fighting for their own survival. No one had seen him go down. No one was coming. He activated his life vest, the CO cartridge hissing, the yellow Mae West inflating awkwardly around his neck. It was a frail gesture of hope in an ocean that stretched for 1,000 empty miles. Standard procedure, he had to get clear of the sinking plane and the spreading fuel, which could ignite. He began to paddle, his flying gear waterlogged and heavy, every movement a struggle. As he paddled, his mind, trained for analysis even in catastrophe, replayed the last moments before the engine quit. The oil pressure flutter, the sudden total silence. It hadn't been combat damage. He was certain of it. No violent hits, no controls severed. It was a mechanical failure, a random, mundane betrayal. After surviving the concentrated might of the Japanese Navy's air arm, fate had chosen a worn piston ring or a failed fuel pump to kill him. He looked at the sky. The contrails of the battle were beginning to dissipate. Here and there, columns of smoke marked where aircraft had fallen. He counted them. A grim tally. Then he saw it, a lone aircraft, not smoking, flying a slow, deliberate pattern to the north, a Japanese seaplane, A-0 searching for survivors. He tensed, sinking lower in the water, but the aircraft turned, its wings catching the sun. It was a Wildcat, one of O'Hare's perhaps. It was searching. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in his chest. He fumbled for his survival kit, attached to his vest. His flare gun was there, sealed in a waterproof casing. But the aircraft was distant, and a single flare was a precious one-shot chance. He had to wait until it was closer, until the pilot might be looking in his direction. He treaded water, his eyes locked on the tiny, circling speck. Minutes passed. The aircraft continued its search pattern, but it was moving east away from him. The distance was growing. It was now or never. His hands, numb with cold, struggled with the casing. He got it open, loaded the flare, pointed it at a high angle ahead of the searching Wildcat's path, and fired. The cartridge shot skyward with a sharp pop. It arced, a brilliant red star against the blue. Then began its lazy, smoking descent. The Wildcat did not change course. It continued its eastward leg, then began a turn to start a new grid. The pilot hadn't seen it, or had seen it and assumed it was debris or a flare from another downed airman. The red star hissed as it hit the water 100 yards away and died. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the lap of waves against his shoulders. Minutes passed. The aircraft continued its search pattern, but it was moving east away from him. The distance was growing. It was now or never. His hands, numb with cold, struggled with the casing. He got it open, loaded the flare, pointed it at a high angle ahead of the searching Wildcat's path, and fired. The cartridge shot skyward with a sharp pop. It arced, a brilliant red star against the blue. Then began its lazy, smoking descent. The Wildcat did not change course. It continued its eastward leg, then began a turn to start a new grid. The pilot hadn't seen it, or had seen it and assumed it was debris or a flare from another downed airman. The red star hissed as it hit the water 100 yards away and died. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the lap of waves against his shoulders. It was buoyant. He could use it as a raft. He hauled himself onto it, the metal skin slippery and unstable, but it kept his torso out of the water. It was a reprieve, however small. Lying there, shivering on the wreckage of his aircraft, he looked back toward the horizon where the battle had raged. The smoke had cleared. The guns were silent. He had no way of knowing if the Enterprise had survived. He had no way of knowing if O'Hare or his wingman were alive. He was a castaway, cut off from the history he had just helped make. The sun climbed higher, beating down on him. In the vast, empty blue, a single dark fin broke the surface 50 yards away. It circled once slowly, then slipped beneath the waves. 8:43 hours, the periphery of the battle. The shark did not attack. It observed a shadow circling just beyond clarity, a patient reminder of the food chain. Thok, lying prone on the broken fuselage, locked his eyes on it. A strange and primal staring contest. He had his .38 caliber survival pistol, but it was a joke against such a creaturey a noisemaker, not a weapon. His only real defense was stillness and the hope that the shark, like the Japanese pilots, would find more interesting prey. The distant drone of engines returned. Not the searching wildcat, but a deeper throbbing pulse. Multiple engines, he strained his neck, scanning the sky. A formation was approaching from the west, flying low and slow. His heart hammered against his ribs. If they were Japanesey flight of Betties returning to Rabaul, or a search planethe would either strafe him in the water or report his position for a surface pick, up by a submarine. Both outcomes ended with him in a prisoner, of, war camp, or dead. The aircraft resolved into shape, not the sleek, twin-engine lines of Japanese bombers. These were angular, high-winged, and unmistakably American PBY Catalina patrol flying boats. He had to make himself unmissable. He looked at the piece of fuselage he was clinging to. The exposed aluminum interior was a dull gray. He needed a signal mirror, but his survival kit's mirror was gone, lost in the ditching. Then he saw it, a jagged piece of broken cockpit glass, about the size of his hand, still wedged in a piece of framing. It was thick, curved, and cracked, but one section had a clear, reflective surface. He worked it free, careful not to cut his numb fingers. Holding it up, he angled it toward the sun, now climbing toward its zenith. A wobbly, distorted dot of light danced on his knee. He shifted, aiming the reflection toward the lead Catalina, still a mile or more out. He focused the spot of light on the Pebyai's cockpit. He swept it back and forth. See me, look down. For an agonizing minute, nothing. The Catalinas droned on, their course unwavering. He kept the light fixed, his arm trembling with the effort. The shark's fin surfaced again, closer now, perhaps 30 yards off. Then, a miracle. The lead Catalina's wing dipped. It banked, a slow, lumbering turn, and its course altered slightly. It was now heading directly for him. The co-pilot's side window slid open, and a tiny figure leaned out, binoculars glinting. Thok fired his last flare. The red star shot up directly in the aircraft's path. The Catalina's response was immediate. It rocked its wings the recognition signal. The second aircraft peeled off to continue the search grid, covering its mate. The lead plane descended, its huge hull settling onto the water with a tremendous graceful spray, taxiing to a stop less than 200 yards away. A hatch opened on its side, and crewmen waved frantically. The surge of relief was so profound it felt like a physical blow. He slid off the fuselage and began to swim, his strokes clumsy and weak. As he did, he looked back. The shark's fin was gone. He reached the bobbing Catalina, its massive whale. Like bulk of fortress of safety, strong hands hauled him up through the hatch, dumping him onto the cold metal decking inside, where he lay gasping, surrounded by the smells of fuel, sweat, and hydraulic fluid. Thok, a crew chief, shouted over the engine noise, wrapping a blanket around him. He could only nod, shivering violently. Hell of a day for a swim, Commander, the man said, offering a canteen. The Enterprise is okay. Took a near miss. Some shrapnel, Shez making steam. Your guys, you broke up the attack. They're calling it a miracle. Thok drank, the warm water tasting like life itself. The Catalina's engines revved, and the aircraft began its ponderous take. Off-run, climbing back into the sky, turning for Henderson Field. He was safe. He had survived the unsurvivable. But as the adrenaline faded, a cold knot of dread formed in his gut, separate from the physical chill. He had made it, his wingman had not. Others from O'Hare's ad hoc squadron had not. The radio chatter of men going and replayed in his head, and his own engine, the quiet, inexplicable death at the moment of salvation. It wasn't right. Fighter engines didn't just quit like that, not without a cause, not after surviving a battle of that intensity. He looked at the crew chief. The aircraft that was searching for me, a Wildcat? Did it get back? The crewman's face clouded. He shook his head. Don't know, sir. We picked up 2 others before you. Both said it was a butcher's bill up there. We're still looking. The flight back to Guadalcanal was a haze of exhaustion, but one thought crystallized in Thok's mind, sharp and unnerving. In combat, death had a logic, a source, a cannon shell, a tracery of machine gun fire. What he had experienced was different. It was an administrative death, a quiet failure in a screaming world. It felt less like chance, and more like a flaw in the machine itself, a flaw that had sent him and 13 other men into a fight where the machines were supposed to be the one thing they could trust. As the green jungle coastline of Guadalcanal appeared below, Thach knew the battle was over, but the war was not, and the next enemy might not be flying a 16 o'clock hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The Catalina's hull kissed the water of Iron Bottom Sound, taxiing toward the crude, shell-pocked pier. The air that hit Thach as the hatch opened was a thick, damp blanket, smelling of rotting vegetation, cordite, and aviation fuel. Henderson Field was not a naval base. It was a contested scrap of earth, a raw wound in the jungle. The control tower was a sandbagged shack. Wrecked aircraft, American and Japanese, lay where they had been pushed off the runway, rusting monuments to the battles. Constant tide. He was met not by a brass band, but by a grim-faced lieutenant from operations. The man's eyes were hollow with fatigue. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Commander Thach, glad you're in one piece. Admiral's compliments, he wants a debrief. Now, Thach, still in his salt, stiffened flight gear, was led to a bunker dug deep into the coral earth. Inside, under the harsh glow of a single gasoline lantern, sat Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, commander of Allied Air Forces in the South Pacific. The admiral looked older than his years, the map before him a spiderweb of penciled tracks and casualty reports. "Sit down, Commander," Fitch said, not looking up. His voice was gravel. "Your after-action report. Start from the scramble." For the next 20 minutes, Thach reconstructed the battle in clipped technical terms: vector, intercept, formation, the weave, O'Hara's arrival, the suicidal shepherding tactic, the engine failure. He was a tactician dissecting a problem. He did not mention the shark. When he finished, the admiral was silent for a long moment, tracing a finger over the plotted position of the Enterprise. "You and O'Hara, you bought her time. We assess you disrupted over half the attacking force before they entered their final runs. Direct bomb hits were 0, near misses. 4. Casualties from strafing and shrapnel 42. The ship is operational." He looked up, his eyes like flint. It was a damned miracle. But miracles have receipts. He slid a typed sheet of paper across the table. It was a preliminary loss roster. Thach's eyes scanned the names. His wingman was listed as missing, presumed down. Of O'Hara's 12-plane reinforcement flight, 4 were confirmed down. 2 were missing. 1 had landed on a nearby island, pilot injured. The arithmetic was brutal. The 14 defenders had suffered a 50% loss rate. They had traded plane for plane, pilot for pilot, with an enemy that could afford the attrition far less. But that was strategic cold comfort. The names had faces. "Your engine," Fitch said, his tone shifting. "Positive, sir. No hits prior. Oil pressure dropped, then it quit." "Clean failure." Fitch nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a dark suspicion. He opened a folder and pulled out 2 other flimsy carbon-copied reports. These came in from the Copihi and from Saratoga's air group over the last week. Lieutenant Daniels flying a Wildcat on a routine patrol, engine seized at 12,000 feet. He bailed out, recovered. Ensign Miller on a combat air patrol, total power loss on final approach. He ditched alongside the ship. The admiral's gaze was heavy. Neither aircraft had taken a single round. All 3 aircraft, including yours, were from the same production batch delivered to the fleet 8 weeks ago. The air in the bunker grew still, the implications unspooled in Thach's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about a single pilot's bad luck. This was a pattern, a flaw in the very tools they were depending on to hold the line against the Zero sabotage. Thach asked, the word feeling alien, unlikely. "The supply chain is too dispersed," Fitch said. "Our intelligence thinks it's worse. They think it's us, our own production." He tapped the reports. "We're building these machines by the tens of thousands. Commander, we're turning Detroit into an aircraft factory. The grind is unprecedented. The tolerances they're being missed, a bad run of bearings from a subcontractor, a rushed welding job on a crankshaft. We're finding engines with machining shavings left in the oil galleries. They're flying time bombs." Thach thought of the sudden, quiet death of his engine at the moment of greatest relief. It hadn't been an enemy. It had been a careless machinist in a factory in Ohio, or an overworked inspector in Connecticut. His war had nearly ended not with a bang, but with a microscopic metal fatigue. "What's being done, sir? Nothing fast enough?" Fitch admitted, a rare flash of helpless anger in his voice. "The need at the front is too great. We can't ground every new Wildcat. The factories are screaming for more orders, not recalls. So we fly them, and we hope they don't quit over enemy territory or on final." Or he gestured at Thak, "when you've just used up all your luck fighting the entire Japanese Navy." He leaned forward, the lantern light carving deep shadows in his face. "I'm telling you this, Thak, because you lived through it. You saw what happens when we're forced to send a handful of planes against an armada. Now imagine that happening across the entire Pacific, not because we lack courage, but because we rushed a lathe. This battle isn't just fought out here. It's being lost or won on factory floors we've never seen." The debrief was over. Thak was dismissed. He walked out of the bunker into the oppressive tropical twilight. The airfield was alive with the sound of engines being tested, of damaged planes being patched. Every roar, every sputter now sounded like a potential betrayal. He was given a cot in a stifling tent, a clean set of khakis. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the calm, unreadable face of the Zero pilot in the turning duel, and then the silent, dead instrument panel of his own plane. A different kind of war had been revealed to him, a war against time, against industrial haste, against the silent statistical killer of mechanical failure. The Japanese had thrown 60 aircraft at them. What if the next time the United States unknowingly sent 60 defective ones? Outside, a new flight of Wildcats, fresh off a transport ship, their paint gleaming, taxied to the revetments. They looked perfect, invincible. Thak knew they were not. The 10th of November, 1942, 10 o'clock hours. The repair tents, Henderson Field. The revelation was a poison in the bloodstream. Thak watched the new Wildcats with a mechanic's suspicion, not a pilot's pride. He sought out the chief petty officer in charge of the field's engine shop, a man named Kowalski, whose forearms were a roadmap of grease and scars, etched by 1,000 torque wrenches. Kowalski listened to Thak's description of the failure of the oil flutter, the sudden silence while chewing an unlit cigar. He didn't look surprised. He looked exhausted. "You're the third this week, Commander," Kowalski said. His voice a low rasp, "not just Wildcats. We had a Dauntless with a brand, new right engine throw a rod on takeoff. Pilot bought it. The bird was 3 days off the transport." He led Thak to the back of the sweltering repair tent, past airframes riddled with bullet holes being meticulously patched. In a corner sat 2 disassembled Pratt Whitney R-1830 engines. The power plants of the Wildcats, they were not battle damaged. They were laid bare like cadavers in an autopsy. "See here," Kowalski said, pointing a grimy finger at a main crankshaft bearing. The metal was scored, deeply gouged. Metal, fatigue, poor hardening. And here, he moved to an oil pump housing, casting impurity, a sand pocket. It cracked under heat and pressure. Oil pressure goes to 0, engine seizes. End of story. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already black. "It's not sabotage, Commander. It's hurry. The folks back home are heroes. Don't get me wrong. They're building miracles. But miracles ain't supposed to have a 400-hour lifespan. We're getting the ones that failed the 400. And first hour out here, Thak stared at the ruined components. This was the enemy Admiral Fitch had hinted at. Not a failure of courage, but a failure of quality. A war fought on 2 front zone against the Zero over the Solomon Sea, and one against statistical probability in a sky full of potential time bombs. "What's the procedure?" Thak asked, his voice tight. "Procedure?" Kowalski barked a short, bitter laugh. "We fly EM till they scream. Then we fix what breaks. We don't have the parts, the time, or the authorization to tear down every new engine. The word from on high is keep 'em flying. So we do." He looked at Thak, his eyes flat. "You want my advice? On your next pre-flight, you listen to that engine like it's gossiping about you. You smell the oil. You watch that pressure gauge like it's the only thing in the world. Because sometimes it is." Thak left the tent, the equatorial sun hammering down on him. The order had come down. He was to be transported back to the Enterprise at first opportunity. Thak looked from the fragile Zero to the hulking, robust frame of a Wildcat being towed past. The American philosophy was the opposite. Build it tough, build it to survive. But what if the thing meant to ensure survival engine was the point of failure? The Zero would kill you with a pilot's skill. The Wildcat might kill you with a factory's mistake. The irony was exquisite and horrifying that evening. In the makeshift officer's mess, he found Butch O'Hare. The ace looked drawn, older than he had any right to be. They shook hands, a grip that communicated everything words could not. Shared horror, shared luck, shared loss. "Heard about your engine," O'Hare said quietly, stirring a cup of tinned coffee. "Mine ran hot the whole way back, like it was trying to tell me something." He met Thak's eyes. "It's not just the zeros anymore, is it?" Thak looked from the fragile Zero to the hulking, robust frame of a Wildcat being towed past. The American philosophy was the opposite: build it tough, build it to survive. But what if the thing meant to ensure survival? The engine was the point of failure. The Zero would kill you with a pilot's skill. The Wildcat might kill you with a factory's mistake. The irony was exquisite and horrifying that evening. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. In the makeshift officer's mess, he found Butch O'Hare. The ace looked drawn, older than he had any right to be. They shook hands, a grip that communicated everything words could not. Shared horror, shared luck, shared loss. "Heard about your engine," O'Hare said quietly, stirring a cup of tinned coffee. "Mine ran hot the whole way back, like it was trying to tell me something." He met Thak's eyes. "It's not just the zeros anymore, is it?" Thak shook his head. "No, it's not." O'Hare nodded slowly. "We're the test pilots, Jimmy, for the whole damn industrial machine. Every time we go up, we're writing a report card for some foreman in Burbank or Bethpage." The transport to return Thak to the Enterprise high-speed destroyer run was scheduled for Faye the next morning. As he tried to rest in the buzzing heat, the sounds of the airfield were a symphony of mechanical anxiety. The cough of an engine refusing to start. The high whine of a propeller in overspeed. The sputter of a fuel line being purged. Each one was a question. Each one was a potential death sentence written not by the enemy, but by an ally. The front line was no longer just a geographic location. It was inside every cylinder, along every camshaft, in the very alloy of the machines they trusted with their lives. He thought of the families of the lost pilots, receiving letters that would say their sons had fallen in combat. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Some had fallen to a war of production, a battle fought in silence, miles above the sea, decided by a fraction of a millimeter of inferior steel. At 0350, as he gathered his few belongings, a siren wailed. Not an air raid, a crash alarm. A new Wildcat, on its dawn patrol takeoff roll, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure just as it left the ground. It slewed off the runway, cartwheeling into the jungle perimeter in a fireball. Thax didn't need to ask. He knew another report would be filed. Another engine would be added to Kowalski's grim collection, and the factory back home would continue to run 3 shifts a day, building the weapons that would win the war and the flaws that would kill the men sent to fight it. He boarded the destroyer, its turbines whining with reliable martial power. He looked back at Henderson Field, wreathed in smoke from the new crash. He was going back to his ship, back to the war in the air. But he knew now that when he climbed into his next cockpit, he would be fighting on 2 fronts, and one of them he couldn't even see. The 14th of November, 1942, 6 o'clock hours, USS Enterprise. Task Force 16, returning to the Enterprise, was not a homecoming. It was a reckoning. The ship bore the fresh, raw scars of the battle-patched flight deck plating, scorched gun mounts, a tense exhaustion in the eyes of every crewman. They looked at Thaksh not as a returning hero, but as a ghost from a fight that had almost taken them all. His survival was a statistical anomaly, a reminder of how close the edge had been. He reported to the air group ready room. The atmosphere was sepulchral, chairs sat empty. His wingman's name had been painted over on the status board, a black missing in its place. Of the 7 pilots who had scrambled with O'Hara's relief flight, only 3 were present. They greeted him with silent nods, the bond of men who have shared a catastrophic secret. The new air group commander, a hardened veteran named Larson, called him in Thaksh. "You're back, your weave, it worked. It's being written up for dissemination to the whole fleet." He said it without celebration. It was a tactical footnote in a ledger of losses. "You're grounded for 48 hours mandatory. After that, you have a new bird, fresh from the factory. It's being tuned now." Thaksh felt a cold wire tighten in his chest. Fresh from the factory, the words were no longer comforting. "Sir, request permission to oversee the engine checks. Personally." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That's Chief's work. Commander, with respect." "Sir, my last engine was checked. I need to see it." A long pause. Larson had read the debrief from Henderson. He understood the unspoken fear. He gave a single curt nod. Don't get in their way. The Enterprise's hangar deck was a cavern of organized chaos, reeking of aviation gas, sweat, and hot metal. Thach found his new F4F-4 Wildcat, its blue-gray paint pristine, looking almost too new for this battered ship. The plane captain, a young mechanic with grease under his nails, was performing the post-assembly run. Up the Pratt Whitney, roaring at different power settings while a team monitored gauges. Thach stood beside the chief in charge, a grizzled master chief named O'Brien. They watched the oil pressure gauge. It held steady. The cylinder head temperatures were within limits. The engine sound was a smooth, powerful baritone, without the ominous ticks or pops Kowalski had taught him to fear. "She's a sweet runner," Commander O'Brien shouted over the din. "Got her tuned up nice?" "I want the oil screen pulled," Thach said. O'Brien blinked. "Sir, it's a brand new engine. We did that on assembly. Do it again now. And I want to see the magneto timing." The chief exchanged a look with the plane captain. This was irregular, an insult to their expertise. But Thach's rank and the unshakable intensity in his gaze left no room for debate. They shut the engine down. With sullen efficiency, they drained the oil, unbolted the oil filter screen housing, and extracted the cylindrical mesh filter. O'Brien held it up to the harsh work light. Trapped in the fine wire mesh were not just the expected few flecks of break. In metal, there were slivers. Tiny, glittering shards of aluminum and steel like malicious confetti. "Son of a bitch," O'Brien whispered, his professional pride evaporating into cold fury. "That's machining trash. That's from the factory floor. That goes into the oil pump. It's a grenade." Thach's mouth was a tight line. He had been right. The enemy was here, in this pristine new machine. Pull the engine. "Commander, we can flush it, clean the galleries, pull it," Thach repeated, his voice leaving no room. "Replace it with a known good engine from a bird that's seen 50 flight hours. One you've nursed yourself." It took 6 hours. The brand new engine, a product of America's heroic industrial might, was lifted unceremoniously from the airframe and set aside for a complete teardown. In its place went a used, slightly oil-stained R-1830, cannibalized from a battle-damaged Wildcat that had flown reliably for months. It was a surgical operation born of pure, hard-won paranoia. As the work was completed, a runner found Thach. "Commander, signal from flag. You're wanted in the Admiral's quarters." This was not Admiral Fitch on Guadalcanal. This was Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, who had just arrived on the Enterprise. Halsey was a force of nature, his face etched with a pugnacious scowl that had become the symbol of American resolve. The cabin was spare. Functional, Halsey didn't offer a seat. He fixed Thach with a stare that felt like a physical impact. "Thach, your report on the engine failures, you made a stink." "Good. I've been screaming about this to Washington for a month. They send me telegrams about production quotas. I send them back body counts with mechanical failure stamped on them." He paced. "A caged tiger. You saw it yourself. We're not just fighting Japan. We're fighting our own goddamn timetable. Every admiral, every general is screaming for more planes, more tanks, more ships. The factories are saints, but they're being pushed to make saints in a hurry. Saints with flaws get men killed." Halsey stopped, turning his fierce gaze on Thach. "I can't ground the fleet, but I can make an example. Your plane, the one you just had them re-engine. You're flying it, and you're going to write a report. After every flight, on every hiccup, every gauge flutter, not to supply. To me, direct, we're going to build a case with blood and data that even Washington can't ignore." It was an order and a burden. Thach was being tasked as a frontline quality control agent in the middle of a shooting war. His new mission was not just to kill Zeros, but to autopsy his own aircraft, to prove the existence of a silent, homegrown enemy. "And, Thach," Halsey said, his voice dropping, "that tactic you used, herding them into the flak, it was brilliant, desperate, and it worked. We're incorporating it into revised cap doctrine. You bought the Enterprise another day. But remember, you can have the best tactics in the world. They don't mean a damn thing if your engine quits on the way to the fight." Dismissed. Thach walked back through the ship's murmuring passageways. He was a weapon, recalibrated, his trust was gone, replaced by a hyper-vigilant scrutiny. He reached his new Wildcat. The used engine was installed, the panels buttoned up. It looked tired. It looked proven. He placed a hand on the cowling, feeling the residual warmth from the test run. This engine had lived. It had flaws. He could see oil leaks, minor corrosion. But its flaws were known, the enemy you know. He looked at the pristine, quarantined new engine sitting on a pallet. It was beautiful. It was a killer for the first time. John Thosh understood the war in its entirety. It was not a duel. It was a siege against a visible enemy across the sea and an invisible one in the very sinews of their own machines. And the siege was just beginning. The 26th of November, 1942, 14 o'clock hours, the slot north of Guadalcanal. The Enterprise was a spearhead, driving north into the narrow, deadly channel known as the slot. Intelligence pointed to a massive Japanese reinforcement convoy, Tokyo Express running men and material to the embattled island. The task force's mission was interdiction to stop them. Facts knew. Old Wildcat felt different. It hummed with a veteran's vibration, a symphony of minor, known imperfections. He had flown 5 combat patrols in it since the engine swap. Each time, he had filed his secret, detailed report for Halsey, minor oil seepage, starboard rocker cover, steady at 75 psi. Magneto drop within spec. The act of logging its every breath was a ritual of control in an uncontrollable world. Now, he led a full squadron of 8 Hellcats, the newer, more powerful successors to the Wildcaten, a fighter's sweep ahead of the strike packages. The American industrial machine was learning, adapting. The F6F Hellcat was the answer to the Zero, tougher, faster in a dive, with a brutal kill rate. But as Thoch looked at the powerful machines around him, he wondered, had they solved the quality problem, or just built a more complex potential for failure? His radio crackled, bandits. 10 o'clock low, multiple bogeys, climbing. It was not the expected intercept. A swarm of Zeros, perhaps 20, had been lurking at wave-top level, using the sea's glare as camouflage. They were climbing now, not to engage the bombers Thoch was escorting, but to kill the escorts themselves. A reversal. The Japanese had learned too, Tally Huck said, his voice flat in gauge. Remember the weave? The 2 formations merged into a swirling, violent ballet. The Hellcats had the power, but the Zeros still held the turning advantage. The sky became a lattice of contrails and tracer fire. Thoch picked a Zero, led it perfectly, and felt the satisfying judder of his 6.50 calibers. The Japanese fighter dissolved in a flash of flame, but the fight was a melee, not a turkey shoot. He saw a Hellcat on his periphery take a fatal burst of 20mm cannon fire to the cockpit, spiraling down, smokeless, and dead. Another, trailing coolant, was disengaging, pleading for cover. Thoch found himself isolated, a Zero clinging to his tail. He snapped into the first half of the Thoch weave, luring the enemy into a pursuing turn. Mason, break now. He called to his designated weaving partner, but Mason was gone, tangled in his own fight. The weave, the tactic born of desperation against numerical odds, required perfect partnership. It required trust, and in the chaos, trust had shattered. The Zero's cannon shells began walking toward his tail. Thoch did the only thing left. He shoved the Hellcat's nose down, trading altitude for life, diving into the cloud deck that sprawled below at Feifei feet. The world turned white, featureless, and silent, but for the roar of his own engine. It was a sensory deprivation chamber. The Zero, he knew, would not follow blindly. It would wait above, or try to guess his exit. This was a temporary reprieve, bought with lost position. He was out of the fight, and his squadron was leaderless. As he flew on instruments, a new, more intimate sound intruded, a faint, high-pitched whine rising from the engine, then a vibration, subtle at first, then growing. A shudder that traveled through the stick and into his bones. The oil pressure gauge began to dance, the needle fluttering between Fei and Fei Psi. No, not here, not now, not in the clouds, alone with an enemy above. It wasn't the catastrophic failure of his Wildcat. This was something else, a bearing screaming its last. A supercharger gear about to let go. The used engine, the reliable one, was dying. The paranoia that had saved him now constricted his throat. He had traded a known, hidden flaw for a known, aging flaw. And the aging flaw had chosen this moment, in this void, to announce itself. He had 2 choices: stay in the clouds and hope the engine held together long enough to navigate blindly back toward the fleet, a near impossibility, or break out into the clear air and become a sitting duck for the waiting Zero in a plane that was shaking itself apart. He watched the oil pressure. It settled at a shaky 45 psi. The vibration remained, a constant teeth, rattling hum. The engine was still producing power, but it was wounded. It was telling him it had minutes, maybe seconds, before something let go entirely. Halsey's words echoed. You can have the best tactics in the world. They don't mean a damn thing if your engine quits on the way to the fight. He wasn't on the way to the fight. He was in it, and his engine was quitting. He made his decision. He would not die in the white silence. He would not give the machine the last word. He would take control of the death, even if it was only to choose its manner. Annie Hellcat. This is Thak, he called, his voice betraying a slight tremble from the vibration. I am in the cloud layer, bearing 180 from Point Charlie. Experiencing severe engine vibration. I am coming out. No response. Either they were too engaged, or he was out of range. He took a deep breath, tightened his harness, and began a slow, careful turn, keeping the wings level, nursing the shuddering engine. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more. He eased back on the throttle, reducing stress, accepting the loss of power. The vibration lessened slightly from a scream to a groan. The gray wall of the cloud's edge appeared ahead. He flew toward it, emerging into the shocking, clear blue and found himself utterly alone. The battle had moved on. The sea was below, empty, the sky above, empty, no zero, no friendlies. He was a solitary, wounded bird in an immense, indifferent arena, but the vibration was still there. The oil pressure was now a steady, ominous 40. He was losing it. He had maybe 50 miles of flight left, if he was lucky. The Enterprise was over 100 miles away. He was going to ditch again the sea, which had once spared him. Now waited to finish the job. He switched his radio to the international distress frequency. Mayday, Mayday. This is Hellcat. The engine emitted a sound like a bag of wrenches being shaken. The vibration became a violent, airframe shaking convulsion. The oil pressure needle plummeted to zero. And then the propeller stopped. It wasn't a seizure, it was a gentle, horrifying, windmilling halt. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double WASP, 18 cylinders of American engineering, had simply quit. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistle of wind. For the second time in a month, Lieutenant Commander John Thak was a glider pilot over the Pacific, his war once again reduced to the physics of descent and the patience of sharks. This time, there were no Pebi Catalinas searching. This time, the fleet was engaged in a major battle. This time, he was truly on his own. He began the drill. Jettison canopy. Mixture to idle cutoff, fuel off. He picked a spot on the endless blue where the swells seemed smallest. As the water rushed up, he had one clear, furious thought. He had survived 60 Japanese fighters. He would not let his own machinery kill him. He would survive this too. He had to. He had a report to file. The 26th of November, 1942, 14:47 hours. The Solomon Sea. The second impact was no less brutal than the first. The Hellcat, heavier and faster than his old Wildcat, struck the water with a sickening, crushing finality. The world became a deafening, churning green tumult. This time, the harness released cleanly. This time, the drill was etched in panic, hardened muscle memory. He kicked free of the sinking cockpit as the cold water swallowed the aircraft, a stream of bubbles marking its grave. He broke the surface, gasping, the taste of salt and aviation fuel thick in his mouth. The silence after the engine's violent death rattle was profound. Only the slap of waves against his May West. He was alone in a vast, empty circle of ocean. No smoke on the horizon marked a battle. No drone of engines promised rescue. He was a speck in a blue desert. His survival kit was intact. He had a flare gun, a dye marker, a small raft. He inflated the one-man raft, a flimsy rubber cocoon, and hauled himself in. It was better than the water, but it was not salvation. It was a postponement. He checked his watch. The battle would be reaching its climax. The strike aircraft would be returning to the carriers, low on fuel and ammunition, counting their losses. His squadron would assume he was dead. The report would filter up. Thak. Missing engine failure. Another data point for Halsey's grim ledger. The irony was absolute. He had become the very evidence he was trying to prevent. The sun was a hammer. He rationed his water, a few metallic sips from a small canteen. He had no idea which way the currents were taking him. North, toward Japanese-held islands, east, into the endless void. He was a prisoner of the sea, and his sentence was exposure, dehydration, or the sharks whose fins he scanned for incessantly. As the hours bled away, A strange clarity settled over him. It was not peace. It was the lucidity of a man with nothing left to lose. But the final accounting, he had faced annihilation from without the 60 fighter sand, now from within the failing engine. The external enemy had a face, a flag, a logic. The internal enemy was a ghost in the machine, a betrayal by the very hands that were supposed to arm him, which was worse. He thought of the factory worker thousands of miles away who might have rushed the final torque on a connecting rod bolt. That worker was a Patriot, working triple shifts, fueled by propaganda and pride. He never intended to kill John Thatch, but he had just as surely as the Zero pilot who had missed. This was the modern war. Death was democratized. It could come from a skilled adversary, or from a tired man on an assembly line, or from a statistician who decided a 2 failure rate was acceptable for the sake of production quotas. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent oranges and purples. The beauty of it was obscene. As the light faded, so did the hope of a daytime search plane. Night on the open ocean was a different kind of enema, cold, star-filled void that leached warmth and sanity. He was preparing for the long, shivering ordeal when he heard it. Not an engine. A sound from the age of sail, the hollow, rhythmic groan of a ship's hull cutting through water. He spun in his tiny raft, peering into the deepening gloom. And there, emerging from the twilight like a phantom, was a silhouette. Not a carrier or a destroyer. The lines were wrong. It was lower, longer, a submarine. He inflated the one-man raft, a flimsy rubber cocoon, and hauled himself in. It was better than the water, but it was not salvation. It was a postponement. He checked his watch. The battle would be reaching its climax. The strike aircraft would be returning to the carriers, low on fuel and ammunition, counting their losses. His squadron would assume he was dead. The report would filter up. Thack. Missing engine failure. Another data point for Halsey's grim ledger. The irony was absolute. He had become the very evidence he was trying to prevent. The sun was a hammer. He rationed his water, a few metallic sips from a small canteen. He had no idea which way the currents were taking him. North, toward Japanese-held islands, east, into the endless void. He was a prisoner of the sea, and his sentence was exposure, dehydration, or the sharks whose fins he scanned for incessantly. A lieutenant leaned over him. "Welcome aboard the Drum. Commander, you pick a hell of a swimming hole." They got him below, wrapped him in blankets, gave him hot coffee that burned his throat. The submarine's interior was a world of dim red light, smelling of diesel, sweat, and cooked food, the smell of life, cramped and precious. The captain, a lean man with calm eyes, debriefed him in the control room. "We heard your mayday, saw you go in. We were running silent, couldn't surface until we were sure the coast was clear." He looked at Doc with a submariner's understanding of lonely death. "You're lucky. We're usually the ones no one finds." Thach gave his report, the engagement, the mechanical failure. The captain nodded slowly. "We've been hearing things, coded traffic about material failures, losing planes to something other than the Japanese." He gestured around his boat at the maze of valves, gauges, and welded steel. "We live or die by the quality of the weld, Commander. Every one of us knows it. Seems you flyboys are learning the same lesson." They would transport him to the nearest friendly port, Numa, in a few days. That night, as the Drum slipped silently beneath the waves, Thach lay in a borrowed bunk. The familiar, profound hum of the boat's electric motors vibrated through him. This machine was reliable. Its men trusted it with their lives, every minute of every day, because they had to. There was no alternative. He had survived again. But the victory felt hollow. He had been saved by a machine of war, but defeated by another. The battle was not just out there, it was in here, in the very foundation of their strength. And as he drifted into an exhausted sleep, he knew his war was no longer about tactics alone. It was about sending a message that had to reach across an ocean, pierce through the roar of production lines, and scream a warning into the deaf ears of necessity. He had to get to Numa. He had to get to a typewriter. He had a report to write that would be his most important mission of the war. The 2nd of December, 1942, Numa, New Caledonia. Headquarters, South Pacific Force. The office was spare, a transplanted piece of the Pentagon in the tropics. The fan turned with a lazy, ineffective click. Before Vice Admiral Halsey on his desk lay not battle maps, but 2 documents. The first was Thach's exhaustive, 12-page report typed in Numa the moment he had been delivered by the Drum. It was not a combat narrative. It was a forensic indictment. It detailed, with clinical precision, the failure of his first Wildcat on November 5th. It chronicled the pattern of failures witnessed at Henderson Field. It described in wrenching technical detail the machining debris found in the oil screen of his brand new replacement on the Enterprise, and it concluded with the catastrophic bearing failure of his Hellcat's used engine on November 5th. Each incident was a data point. Together, they formed a trajectory of systemic failure. The second document was a casualty list from the recent naval battles around Guadalcanal. Halsey had taken a red pencil and circled every entry next to, which was scribbled mechanical failure, engine loss, or cause unknown, not combat. The circles bled across the page like wounds. Thach stood at attention, still gaunt from his ordeal. Halsey did not look at him. He stared at the papers, his jaw working. The fierce, bullish energy that defined him was coiled, silent, and dangerous. "They're calling it infant mortality," Halsey finally said. His voice a low growl. A nice, clean statistical term from the production boys. It means a certain percentage of engines are expected to fail in their first 100 hours of operation. It's baked into their models. He looked up, and his eyes were volcanic. "Infant mortality. My pilots are not statistics. They are not a percentage. They are men who drown in the ocean because some accountant decided their lives were an acceptable margin of error." He picked up Thach's report, its pages fluttering slightly. This is what I needed. Not an admiral's complaint, a combat pilot's testimony, a tactical genius telling them his greatest enemy isn't the zero. It's the machine has told to trust. He stood, leaning on the desk. "I'm sending this directly to King in Washington, not through channels, direct. With my cover letter stating that every plane we lose to a factory flaw is a plane that isn't killing the Japanese. That every pilot we bury from a bad bearing is a greater strategic loss than a sunken destroyer." Halsey came around the desk, stopping before Thach. "You've done your duty, Commander. More than you've fought the battle in the air, and you've diagnosed the battle at home. Now I want you to do one more thing, sir. I'm reassigning you. Temporary duty. You're going back to the States, to the Grumman plant in Bethpage, to the Pratt Whitney factory in Connecticut. You're going to stand on their clean, safe factory floors, and you're going to look the foreman and the machinists and the engineers in the eye, and you're going to tell them about the silence after an engine quits at 10,000 feet. You're going to describe the smell of salt water and fuel as you wait for a shark. You're going to show them the names on this list." He tapped the red circled casualty report. "You're going to make infant mortality have a face. Your face, it was the ultimate mission, a return not to rest, but to the source." He was to become a prophet of quality, a combat veteran, haunting the temples of production. Thach returned to the United States not to fanfare but to a quiet, grim purpose. In the vast, deafening sheds of Grumman, he stood before assembled workers, still in his faded flight jacket. He did not speak of glory, he spoke of metal fatigue. He held up a ruined crankshaft bearing. "This was in a plane a friend of mine flew," he'd say, his voice carrying over the whine of machinery. "It failed over the Solomon Sea. He didn't die from a Japanese bullet. He died because this," he shook the bearing, "wasn't hardened right, because someone was in a hurry." In the pristine engineering offices of Pratt Whitney, he laid out photographs of downed aircraft, not destroyed by enemy fire, but by internal catastrophe. "You are the front line," he told the designers. "Every decision you make on a drawing board, every tolerance, every material species a life, or death decision for a boy you'll never meet." The message was brutal, personal, and effective. It bypassed the bureaucracy and struck directly at the pride of the workers. The Thach visits, as they became known, sparked a grassroots movement. Workers instituted their own unofficial inspection steps. Machinists began stamping their personal marks on critical components, a silent vow of accountability. The abstract concept of quality control became a moral imperative. A man's life depends on this weld. Thach returned to the Pacific in early Fay. The war had grown vaster, more brutal. But something had changed. The Hellcats and Corsairs arriving on the carriers had a different feel. They weren't just new. They were solid. The epidemic of unexplained engine failures began to taper off. The reports of mechanical failure on casualty lists grew rarer. He would fly again, lead again, fight again. But his most decisive victory was not recorded in his kill count, which continued to rise. It was etched in the improved survival rates of the pilots who came after him. It was measured in the relentless, crushing reliability of the American war machine that finally, truly, found its footing. The lesson of November 1942 was not just about a tactical weave against impossible odds. It was about a deeper, more essential weave, the fragile, vital connection between the man in the cockpit and the unknown hands that built it, between courage on the front line and conscience on the factory floor. John Tak had proven that will alone could not win the war. But will, combined with unyielding quality, could become an avalanche. The Japanese had thrown 60 fighters at 2 men. They had lost. In the end, America's greatest enemy had not been the Zero, but its own reflection in a flawed piece of steel. And that was an enemy that, once seen, could be defeated. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more.